Alright, good morning peeps. This is lesson 2 on electricity. So after we got through with what we're going to put all in here and fill this up, step 2 is figuring out how much electrical means you have at your disposal. So first off, we got to differentiate between 220 and 110. 220 is a voltage that your stove runs on, that large appliances run on. Usually growers hook up ballast to these outlets. So your fans, your bubblers, your pumps, almost nothing like that works on 220 except for large objects like your ballasts and your lights, or your chillers, or an AC unit. Those typically work on 220. And the benefits of doing that are the equipment runs on less amperage because you're supplying double the amount of voltage, and your equipment runs a lot easier, meaning that the equipment will actually run just slightly a little bit cooler than what it would run on 110 because it has to draw more electricity through that line. There's also 3-phase 440, but typically if you're not on a farm, you're not going to really need to worry about that. And then if you are on a farm, you already know what I'm talking about, and that's something that you already have an electrician come in and do for a 3-phase. Now that brings me into the subject matter of electrocution is a real thing. I've gotten electrocuted several times. I'm sure some of you guys have put your finger in an outlet at some point and gotten electrocuted. It is a real thing. Now, putting your finger in the wall and getting electrocuted, that is one thing. That will wake you up in the morning like an incredibly good cup of coffee. Once we're talking about 220 and above, this gets to the point to where you physically cannot let go of the circuit without dying. What I actually mean from that is there'll be so much electricity flowing through the circuit that if you put your two hands on that circuit, it will spasm your hand out so much that you will literally not be able to let go from the circuit, and you will fry yourself till you're cooked. Sometimes you will get bounced out of the circuit. I've heard of people getting bounced out by 220s and knocked across the room. Those guys are lucky. Now, if you get too much amperage in that 220, you will fry yourself, and you will not be able to let go of that circuit. It will be the last mistake you will ever make in your life. Electrocution is real, and if you have any doubts, the thing I would do is get a professional involved. There's no harm and foul in doing that. The other thing, if you're getting a little squirrely on, I don't want to get an electrician in here and see my grow, I've never heard an electrician turning anybody in. I've never heard of an electrician trying to have a paying customer and having him do something dirty to a paying customer. The other thing I would say is if you're really still on the edge with having an outsider in to just check safety, because that's what he's going to be appreciating your concern with, is go out to the clubs. I'm in here in San Francisco, so I have a wealth of things that I can get. I can go to Oaksterdam. I can go and see their plumber, their electrician, their contractor list. You can call any of those guys. They're 420 friendly. The other thing I would do is go to your local clubs. Ask around to the clubs and say, hey, who did your electricity? Do you have an electrician that you could, tell me or give me some clues that I can go down and ask him what I could do? The other thing is just asking people that you know. That will solve the whole issue 9 times out of 10. So just trying to run down your friend sources, your club sources, all of those things can lead you to an electrician that you should be able to feel really incredibly safe with, and that can come in and at least double check your work and figure out if things are right or if things are wrong. And it's only $200 or $300 you guys are going to spend. I can guarantee you, versus a fire, versus a failure, versus anything else at $200 or $300, best money you have ever spent. You go to sleep while this stuff is on. Be reassured that what you have done is correct and safe. It's worth every penny. And hit on this topic real quickly for all of you guys out there that are thinking of stealing power and how keen of an idea that is. It is not a keen idea. You will get caught up with it. That is the first thing police and firefighters and insurance agents and everybody look for. That is the first question you will get asked in a fire, if they're inspecting anything. They're gonna want to see where your power is coming from. Very first question. So there's been several fires in the paper. I've talked to several firefighters who have came into houses where they've been growing in every single room of the house, from the closets to the kitchens to the bathrooms. And this firefighter said the fire started because they were taking a 440 line straight into their house and connecting all the 440 line, and the line was actually going up the stairs. You know what started the fire was they had this wire connected to other wires, and the firefighter tripped over one of those wires, sparked a flame, and then that initiated the fire in the dwelling. So seriously, don't steal power. It will bite you in the ass in the end. Because it will cause a lot of collateral damage, and you'll have to pay a lot of penalties for stuff like that. Now, proper wiring. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, but it's incredibly important, and every time I go in somewhere, I usually see spaghetti happening so often. The rule I would say with proper wiring is you either know or you learn. And this isn't a science experiment. This is something that you need to know. This is some dangerous stuff. One thing I would say, if you're not going to get an electrician, take a free class at your college. Take a class at college and get help with that. And when in doubt, again, get help. You know, the one mistake you make could be the last mistake you make. And I know I'm harping on this a lot, but this is the one thing that I think people who feel a little too confident about make too many mistakes with, and the people who are confident about don't really go after a second opinion, and it makes a huge amount of difference. Also, make sure what's behind that outlet. Let me talk about the outlet in general for a second right now. The outlet that you should really be thinking about using is a no-fault gang. So a gang would be two outlets put together. So a no-fault outlet or a no-fault gang group would have the two black and red buttons. You usually see this on like your bathrooms and on kitchens. This will have a test and reset function. It'll have its own fuse that's inside of that outlet. The advantage to that is it doesn't need to go all the way back to the fuse box to be able to trip. It'll trip right at the outlet. This saves your ass from fires. Just flat out. This saves your ass from fires because that no-fault outlet at the wall will trip way before it would have tripped in the circuit. Now, if that takes a long time to build up in the circuit to be able to actually pop and flip off, that could be the time it takes to also melt things down where the source had the heat buildup. So the no-fault, what it will do is it will circumvent that and make sure that that trips before it even can get back to the box. Super big advantage. The other thing you want to know is what's behind that outlet. quite literally what kind of wiring is behind your wall. Now there's two types of wiring that I typically see. One type of wiring I'm glad to see. Everything's copper, everything's at least 12 gauge, everything's thick and nice. It's a solid copper wire. I'm not looking for strands or anything like that. We're good. Now the other way that I usually see things go south is where you have a copper wire and then you have an aluminum wire. These are used back in the day. These aren't, aluminum isn't a very good conductive material in the sense that it melts. So if that wire gets hot, that wire will tend to melt before the copper would have melted, which makes a huge electrical fire problem. So once you start seeing that kind of stuff back in your wall, the amount that I usually go on my threshold, because if I have 10 amps, I only want to use 9 of them, that threshold then tends to go up a little bit more. I will tend to say if I have a 10 amp fuse, all the amps I can use out of that is 8. So having all that copper behind there is incredibly important. So one of the first things that I do when I get into a blank room is I look and see if I have enough power. And proper wiring also includes making a drip line. If you don't know what a drip line is on an electrical circuit, look that up. Also, get a voltage meter. Those voltage meters are going to tell you a lot. Those voltage meters are going to tell you how much draw you have at the end of the line, how much you have at the beginning of your outlet, the consistency of your voltage. It's going to tell you a lot, because if you're hooking up your own electric and you're doing all your wiring, you're going to want to know all those facts and figures, because if you don't, you're going to wind up into popping fuses more than likely. And if it doesn't have a UL rating, you're not using it, flat out. That is one other thing that people are going to ask you after the fact of the fire, is if everything was UL rated. And if they go through and they find that there was some sketchy piece of equipment in there, you're screwed. So is 1,000 watts 1,000 watts? So is that 1,000 watt light drawing 1,000 watts? No. It's actually drawing more. The further I have from my source that is the wall or the source of the electricity, the more I'm probably going to draw. The less that is, the more likely I'm going to draw close to 1,000. Is 1,000 watts 1,000 watts? So is that 1,000 watt light drawing 1,000 watts? No, it's drawing a little more. If I had that light further away from the electrical source, like 100 feet, 150 feet, it would be drawing more watts than if I had it 5 feet from the source. So 1,000 watts isn't 1,000 watts, and the draw it takes to get that to turn on initially is much more than it takes to operate this right now. So the initial draw is what that's called, is going to be probably 10%, up to 10% of the value of this piece. So this might draw 1,100 watts when it first initially gets turned on. Then it will go down to somewhere around 1,040 watts for the full draw. So no, 1,000 watts is not 1,000 watts. And when you're dealing with how many amps you're pulling, that is a huge concern. Which leads me into amperage is your limitation. So When I'm going into a room at first, a blank room, what I'm looking for is how many amps does the circuit have that I can use. So in this situation, where you're at a house setting or an apartment setting, and you have one small grow, I'm using two 15 amp. I'm actually using one 20 amp for what I hook my light into, and then I'm using a separate 15 amp for all my auxiliary equipment, being the rest of the T5s, my fan, my ozone generator, anything else that I have to plug in other than the ballast is plugged in one circuit. The ballast is separately plugged into another circuit. I'm currently using 110 to power the ballast, so that's a whopping 9.5 amps that I'm having to juggle in that one circuit, in that 120 amp circuit. You want to have the biggest amperage circuit for your lights that you can. Now, if I was asked how many physical lights could I actually plug into that circuit, the maximum would be 2, because 2 9.5 amps getting plus together is about 19 amps, which would be really pushing the amount on my overhead and my initial draw. I might pop fuses still with that. I don't think I would, but it would be on the edge. And my lines would probably be pretty warm as far as all my wiring. So anything else that I would put on there would put it on the edge and blow the circuit for sure. And I would have to go back to the fuse box and pop the circuit. So when you're coming into a space or you're coming into a situation, the first thing in a warehouse, in a home, in any kind of setting, the first thing a professional grower is going to do is go to the circuit box, open it up, and see what he's working with. Now, sometimes you can find things in your house like a thermostat, and if you have something like I have in here, where you have water that's getting electrically heated to heat your dwelling, you just scored. Because probably more likely that's a 220 going to that thermostat. If you pop your thermostat off and you take the wiring off that thermostat, what you have is the circuit that probably went to that thermostat, which is a 220, which then if you have a 10 or let's say you had a 10 amp in a 220, you could run 2,000 watt lights, because if we take something that has 10 amps using 110, if it's using 220, it's now using 5 amps. So when we use 220, we half our amperage. So whatever that circuit is has a way more wealth that it can give us as far as large amounts of power. So amperage is our limitation. The first thing you need to look at is that circuit box to figure out how much lights you can put in there and how much equipment you can put in there. So after we're picking cannabis, before we're figuring out can we fill this entire area up, that question is answered through the circuit box and through how much you can actually allocate, which you also have to think all this extra equipment. You also have to think if it's in a residential dwelling, is your vacuum, is your microwave, is your stove, is everything else that you're actually running. So keeping things separately on separate circuits that you can know that you're not going to overload, like all I'm using this circuit for is my refrigerator and that's it. Well, you could probably put something on that circuit. That refrigerator's probably not using that much power, and it's not going to have that much draw or give you so much surprise. Nothing's going to get plugged in there like a hairdryer or a vacuum or something that's going to consume wealths of amperage that would maybe blow the circuit. So the one thing I usually suggest is making a wall plate. Now, a wall plate to me is a surface on your wall that you actually put all your plugs, your plug strips, anything that can get visually turned on and off, anything that you visually plug in. I usually try to make a nice wood plate that I screw and secure everything into. This makes it so when you're entering the room, you understand that you unplugged your pump to change your reservoir. Or this makes it so you can visually see what things are on and what things are off, what things are working, what things are not. And if something happens like a flood or something weird like that, you're able to just come in, look at the wall, and say, unplug that right away. It's something that can save a situation, something that can save a disaster. Crucially important. And just to be able to visually digest your wiring every day and see that it's healthy and see that nothing's going on, see that there's no melting plastic or anything like that. All these things actually occur pretty regularly. So looking at that and figuring that out, that's just a wealth of knowledge. And for somebody who's beginning, who gets in a situation and then starts to panic, this makes it so much easier for that person to control the situation. The wall plate makes the cords not go everywhere. Tie your cords together. If you don't, there will be a short at some point. These are all the things you want to avoid. This is why this goes into such a long explanation and such a long lesson plan. I can never get out of going into this lesson plan and making this short because of the danger involved and because of the high technicality of skill that you need to actually get through this and get through it successfully. So many people try to do this on their own and do a pretty good job, and a pretty good job doesn't mean you're not going to have a really good chance of having a fire. So this is why I stress out on this stuff a lot. I was going to talk about flip-flops, using for balances. If you're interested in that, I would check those out. Those are things you can use to make that you have 2 lights on a circuit, but only using the amperage for 1 light. If you're interested in that, go look up flip-flops, flip-flop relays, but really I suggest just going with a program that utilizes all your lights being on at night. Because you're going to save a lot of electricity that way. There's usually night and weekend plans that you're going to get from your provider. What that's going to do is have the least amount of kilowatt charge of money at night versus having it on in the day. They want you to have it on at off-peak hours. What that's going to do is, 1, have it on at night, make your electricity cheaper from your provider. And what it's also going to do, 2, at nighttime, you have the coolest amount of temperatures, you have the best advantage with keeping your environment in check by having that HPS on at night. Your flowering light should be on basically from 9 o'clock at night till 9 o'clock in the morning. So, a kilowatt and figuring out a bill. This is also a big one. For lights like this is incredibly easy. How to basically figure out how much this is all going to cost. So this is basically done all by watts. So 1,000 watts is a kilowatt. A kilowatt can range anywhere from 15 cents to about 45 cents a kilowatt hour. Mine here, the way I use it, it averages out at about 29 cents. It's just rounded to 30 cents a kilowatt. So that means every hour that I have 1,000 watts on, if I have 1,000 watts on for an hour, that is a kilowatt, 1,000 watts per hour. So every hour that I have this light on, I'm pretty much spending, just on the light alone, 30 cents an hour. Now, a fan that has 100 watts to it will take 10 hours to create 1 kilowatt. So when we figure watts, we have to figure how many watts is this object that I'm using. And I figure down to my fans, the bubbler, everything. How many watts is my light? How many watts is my fan? How many watts is my T5? I calculate how many hours they're on. I come out with that figure. I divide by 1,000, and that gives me my number of kilowatts. From there, I can calculate how much my monthly bill is. For something like this, that is 1,000 watt light and a couple of T5s to run some veg, you're probably going to be spending in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 bucks a month on this particular project. Mine comes out to about 180 a month. So when figuring this out, that is a huge obstacle, because the next thing we're going to have to do coming up in these lessons is figure out a budget. And that budget crucially depends on how much money you're able to allocate each month. Just in electricity. Your mistakes, that will cost you. You still have to pay for those in electricity. And then all your equipment and everything else comes after that. So getting this electricity down, figuring out how to calculate your bill is incredibly crucial. Again, you take all your watts, you take all the hours per day that they're on, you multiply that, come out with that map, then multiply that by 30. Then you will divide that by 1,000, and then you will have how many kilowatts you are using per month. You take that and you multiply that. I would just generally multiply that by 30 cents, and then you have your bill that you're going to have at the end of the month. And it's a pretty accurate, correct representation of what you're actually going to be paying. I would get very used to that calculated number, and I would get used to how much money you're going to maybe spending on your mistakes as well too, because when things don't work out, you're still spending that $180 a month allocating on this experiment. Because of, now I say like it fluctuates because you're on different places, have different base and tiers. You're just going to have to go through your electricity bill and try to find the best situation and best way that you can structure your time frames and how much you're using. And definitely stay off peak as much as you can. And absolutely ask your service provider for plans on trying to save money. What they won't do, even if they know that you are incredibly sick or incredibly ill-habilitated or you're a senior citizen, they will definitely take advantage of you and never bring up these policies that could save you literally hundreds of dollars on your bill. Even with one light, we're talking the difference between $40, maybe $50 on your bill, depending on what kind of plan you have. So the first thing I would do is try to call up your provider and figure out a night or a weekend plan or some kind of plan that's going to be a benefit to you having a large amount of power on at night. Which leads me to smart meters. Now that's why all these smart meters are actually crucially working, is because they're able to tell the power company when it is that I'm actually using that power. So all these nighttime plans are incredibly accurate because of that. So I am a big fan for smart meters. A regular meter, the one thing, if you're in a state that does not have medical or anything, that meter will tell a huge amount of description if that meter reader comes by and reads your meter while it is on and your lights are on. The meter analog will literally be going like this. What you want to do, again, with the lights being on at night, and this was a really old philosophy of a lot of growers back in the 90s, is you want your lights on at night as well, because that meter reader, when he comes to read your meter in the daytime, will see a normal meter just spinning super slow. He will see that it's using a lot of power, but what he will also see is that it's not using a lot of power at the time. If someone's not home and and that meter is just kicking, that gives him an indication that something is up. Maybe he's not thinking like, oh, this guy's got to grow, but maybe he's thinking something's off in the grid here, or something's off with this particular unit or this particular meter here, and more investigation needs to happen to figure out if something's wrong and we have to protect the customer. That is happening. The meter guy who's seeing the meter spinning on its top, that has happened. These all have happened to bubble out, and I have known situations that have caused a bad situation like that to happen. If you're in a legal state, don't trip out about that. So the thing I would say in wrapping this up is it's really important to get an electrician to second guess your work, and trust in him that he's not going to do anything that's going to harm you. The other thing I would concentrate on is staying away from plug strips as much as possible and going directly into the wall. Using the no-fault circuits and replacing all your outlets with no-fault outlets. The other thing I would think about doing is using beefy relays. So those 4-light relays, I would seriously start to look at those. If you don't know what a 4-light relay is, look that up. 4-light relay hydroponics, you'll see it come up. Those have huge beefy relays that are going to work your lights and turn them on and off. Then you can plug that into a dial timer that should be able, that'll have no draw, and that'll actually work out better for you. Those dial timers, if you're plugging a 1,000-watt light into a dial timer, I know on the back they say 1,500 watts, and I know on the back they say 15 amp, which cover the amount that you're using. But what the problem is if they have a problem, those relays are so thin and so small, if they have a problem, they'll melt. If you have any kind of melting in a situation, you're probably going to have a fire. Now what's going to happen in a big relay is if that relay pops or that relay goes bad, the plastic on the outside of that is UL plastic, so it's not going to melt very easily, it's not going to catch fire very easily. The relays in there are vented, they're not going to actually be able to cause a fire themselves. Those are more than likely never going to fail in your room, where the dial timer and those plug strips absolutely will fail. They will be the first things to fail in your room. Time and time again, ask every grower that you know, how many plug strips, how many dial timers have you went through? And it'll be such a wealth of them, and you'll hear enough stories that should be able to back up what it is I'm saying. But thanks for dealing with this, and thanks for hanging with me for the whole lesson, and on to lesson 3. Thanks, Hannah, for making an appearance. I know I can trust you to do it.